So discussion and conclusion is always think about your alignment, but where the discussion comes in, we talked about this last week, that the results are simply what happened. The discussion is where you get to really critically evaluate what happened. This is your opportunity to explain, like, what happened, what were the differences between the methods and the results, and what were the differences between the results and the lit review, like what you sort of have said that conversation was, what other researchers have found. Were there differences? Were there similarities? So this is where you're really doing a lot of critical thinking and analysis, and you're interpreting. Whereas with the results, you were simply, reporting like a reporter. And then your conclusion we'll get to, but don't overthink it. It's really a summary of everything that's come before. So the discussion tells why. It's the so what. It's just that whenever we talk when editors talk about manuscripts that they're publishing, they'll sometimes say, oh, it was a good study, but it didn't have a good so what. And that's really where it appears in the discussion, meaning, why was this all important? What was this all about? And that's why sometimes when I'm reading articles, I'll jump to the discussion first before I read anything else, because I want to see that so what. I wouldn't do that reading fiction, but scholarly articles I would. So the discussion has four purposes. It interprets and explains your results. So again, the results section is reporting. This is interpreting. Why did things happen? You're answering your research questions. You're again justifying your approach and critically evaluating your study. So you're going to include all the major findings. Again, look at the methods, look at the results. Every method should have a result and vice versa. And then every result should be discussed in the discussion. You don't want to skip any of them. Some will be discussed more than others, but you don't want to skip any of them. What did they all mean? How do they relate to the research from the literature review? What were the limitations? Now, in the introduction chapter or the beginning, we had those limitations, delimitations, where we talked about the limitations being things you had no control over. And those you were sort of guessing or hypothesizing. You're saying time, you're saying location, you're saying, money. But the limitations in the discussion are based on what really happened. So, like, let's say your plan was to do a study on nurses and to include both male and female nurses as your participants in your study. But you couldn't find any male nurses. There weren't any where you were, or maybe they weren't available for your study. So that would be a limitation. You would say, we only had female nurses in this study, or whatever. We had a homogeneous sample. That's something you wouldn't have known in chapter 1 because you were still hoping for the best. So these limitations are, what limitations based on what happened during your project or during your study. Bring up those surprising, unexpected, inconclusive results. As I said last week, we learn a lot from those. We learn a lot from what we weren't expecting. And then provide suggestions for future research. And those can be based on those limitations. If you say, we only had female nurses, suggestions for future research, try to find some male nurses to include in the data. What you're not going to do is bring in anything that is new, was not mentioned before. Everything you're talking about is going to be based on your results or the lit review, nothing unwarranted. You want that beautiful alignment, nothing tangential, and everything should be supported by the data of the study. Now, the discussion format can be a little funny in terms of verbs. Don't worry about that until you're revising. Don't worry while you're drafting. But in the discussion section, you're using the past tense to summarize the findings of your research. When you're talking about your study or your program, that's the past tense. But when you're interpreting and describing the significance, you're using the present tense. So you might have a combination of past and present tense, even within one sentence, like this example here. 63% of children demonstrated an elevated risk of at least one risk factor, an elevated level, excuse me, of at least one risk factor. So that was from this person's study. So it was demonstrated, indicating that children with obesity are at an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. That's applying it to, like, what does this all mean? What's the significance? And then you might even be using the future tense when you're talking about those suggestions for future research. Future researchers should do this. They will, and the methods reported will provide. So again, don't worry about that while you're drafting. And certainly a writing center coach can help you to tease all of that out. Briefly summarize the implications of your finding, explain why they're important, the so what, and provide suggestions for future research. Here's a suggestion for discussion, and the thing that I put in the chat box has other, like the check boxes have other ideas for discussion, but you can rewrite your research questions, you can explain how results relate, but basically, if you received a template from your department, follow that. They might just have you follow your results chapter and kind of use that as a template, go in the same order as the results. One resource I really love for discussion phrases is this APA style guide that we have in the Writing Center. And let me just stop sharing and show that to you, because it is a really good resource. And it's in our Capstone and Dissertation resource page. And what it does is it gives you the beginning of sentences. Like when you're linking findings of previous research, the pattern of results is consistent with the previous literature, or these results are consistent with the claim that, and you just fill it in. It's like Mad Libs. It's real. I find it really, really useful for people who are feeling like, oh, I don't know what I should say. Okay, so let me stop sharing that and go back to my presentation. We got a lot of stuff to cover. Okay, so then what's the difference between the discussion and the conclusion? If your discussion has sort of like a summary and a so what and what's so important. Well, your conclusion, as I said earlier, is like any other conclusion. You're restating your hypothesis or your purpose. If you don't have a hypothesis, like the purpose of this project was to restating the most important findings, highlight the limitations, highlight the significance, and state a future direction. Make sure that you are not, if we look at the should column is what I just said, the should not, you're not introducing anything new, just like you wouldn't in any other conclusion, right? Nothing new, no new data. And again, don't fail to mention something that was really important. But your conclusion goes from narrow to broad. So thesis is your hypothesis or like the purpose of the project. What was the purpose? And then just a couple of your main points, the main findings, and then general, contextualizing your research, like where are we going with this now? What does this mean in terms of the future? So here is one example, and you can see it's really short. That's what I'm saying, like don't overthink your conclusions. They can be a paragraph, 2 paragraphs. Again, check your template. Some departments might want them a little bit longer, but they don't tend to be terribly long. So based on the reviewed literature and clinical implementation of bedside handoff walking arounds, a change of shift report at the bedside through the use of standardized electronic handoff promotes a cohesive atmosphere of patient safety and satisfaction. That was their purpose and their hypothesis. That's what they were trying to prove. This nurse-driven intervention to improve patient safety and satisfaction continues to promote quality patient care and safety while maximizing effective communication. The positive effect that bedside handoff and walking rounds have on patients, families, nurses, and other clinical staff outweighs the barriers of implementation. So again, these were some of the major findings. Now, what does all this mean? Where are we going? Additional research should explore how patient involvement and interaction in the handoff process affect anxiety and call bell usage. In addition, research should continue to examine the relationship between handoff formats and patient harm, error detection, and general patient satisfaction. And yes, they probably did mention those things in the discussion. That's okay. It's okay if they reworded it. They didn't just cut and paste it, but it's okay that the same idea was there. And one other one, these case studies, so this was from a case study, obviously, these case studies suggested stand-up paddleboard aquatic therapy, SUPAT, is an innovative approach to aquatic therapy that provides children with cerebral palsy an opportunity to participate in a recreational sport while improving gross motor skills and reducing fall risk. So again, that was their hypotheses, right? That's what they were trying to prove. That was the whole purpose. SUPAT could be a viable therapeutic intervention that's fun, allows the child to interact with the natural environment, and may increase overall participation in therapy sessions and leisure time physical activity, as well as in the community. These are what they found by doing the case studies. What does it all mean? These studies indicated the paddleboard can be used as a therapeutic tool for clinicians to bridge the gap between traditional interventions by providing a fun, unique approach to pediatric aquatic therapy. So again, don't overthink it. What was your purpose? What were the major findings? Where are you going with this? What does this all mean? How does this lead into the future? Now let's talk about a few little formatting things, like our abstracts, appendices, and heading levels, because those are important. The abstract is written last, even though it's the first thing that readers read. And we're all very familiar with an abstract. We know what it does. It determines whether we're going to read, right? You use it as a vetting system when you're doing research to determine what you're going to read. So it has to be dense with information and contain essential terms so that readers can find that article during a search. So like those terms should, like we're plugging them into the research. Those are the terms that those articles will pop up. So abstracts need to be accurate. And this is why you wait to write it at the end, because it has to completely match. The abstract has to match what happens in the manuscript. And if you write your abstract too early and then you go back and you're revising your manuscript, you have to go back and revise the abstract. It's best to wait. It should have quantifiable information that's matching the body. It should be non-evaluative. It should be coherent and readable with the active voice, clear language, and concise. Only most important points. So here's what I do for abstracts. I write a sentence for the problem. I might have like a background sentence, a sentence from the background section, but definitely the problem, the purpose, maybe one or two sentences for the method, depending on the project and the study, what's really needed. The key, a couple sentences with the main results. And then sort of like, what does it mean at the end? And then I step back and see what I have and I finesse that. And I'll use like the Hemingway app, which is free to use online, hemingwayapp.com. And I'll just plug it in, and that will sometimes tell me where I'm being too wordy and where I can be more concise. And that's not an overuse of AI. It's not writing it for me. It's just like underlining things and saying this is really wordy. So again, abstracts are used for selection to know whether we're going to keep reading, and for indexing so that, library and literature searches, your document will come up. If your abstract is written correctly, it'll come up for the right researchers. So your keywords are important, and even the terms that you're using in the abstract itself. The abstract is its own page after the title page. The label abstract is bold and centered. The abstract is one single paragraph that's not indented, but it is double spaced, just like the rest of your manuscript. Your entire manuscript is double spaced, including your references. If you're writing a structured abstract, you'll have labels. And often when you're writing for publication, they'll give you the labels if you're writing a structured abstract. And APA abstracts tend to be 250 words. Again, check your template. And if you're writing for publication, check the submission guidelines, because they can be, a little bit different. Again, some abstracts have keywords. If you're writing for publication, sometimes the editor would prefer to be the one to make the keywords. So check on that. But the label keywords is in italics, and that is indented. And then there's a colon after it. The keywords are lowercase unless they're proper nouns. Everything's in a regular font, separated by commas, no period at the end. And usually there are 3 to 5 keywords. Again, those really important terms that are specific to your study or program, so that when a researcher plugs them into a search engine, your document comes up. You don't want something really, vague, like people, like everything has people in it. You want something that's about your project or study. So here's a sample abstract, and I made it single space to fit on the slide, but it should be double spaced. So 25% of people experiencing homelessness have pets, but few transitional housing programs allow pets. Therefore, there's a gap in the literature about the experience of pet ownership during the transitional housing process. So that's the problem. The study aimed to explore pet owners' experiences at a transitional housing site in San Diego County. That's the purpose. The student interviewed 2 current dog owners and 4 recent dog owners. Now we're in the methods. All participants prioritized their pets because of the strong bond they shared with their pet. Results. They described their relationship between themselves and their dog to be stronger than their relationships with family members and friends. Their prioritization of their dogs positively and negatively influenced occupational engagement. While receiving services, owners experienced consequences when separated from their dogs, including a decline in motivation, depressed mood, and loss of purpose. 3 participants lost ownership of their dogs due to unreliable caregivers, resulting in unresolved emotions that interfered with accomplishing goals. So that's results. Now we're moving into the where do we go kind of so what. Since their dogs are significant figures in their lives, it's essential to consider them when determining goals and housing options. Working towards sheltering dogs with their owners has potential positive benefits. And the keywords they identified were homelessness, pet owners, transitional housing, separation from pet, and occupational engagement. Let's look at one more. This one is a structure, just to show you what a structured abstract looks like. So again, when you're doing a structured abstract, if you're writing for publication, they tend to they'll say, we want background, methods, results, conclusions. And you just plug it in. You go into your manuscript and you kind of find that, you don't necessarily cut and paste, but you kind of put it in there and finesse it. And so you're just saying the background, they gave some of their background information about sleep and graduate students, their methods, what did they do, how many people, how many participants, the results, what did they find? Again, just a couple sentences, and then the conclusion. Future research should do this, and their keywords were graduate students, stress, burnout, and sleep. So again, try to just plunk some stuff down, finesse it, make it fit the word count. Don't worry about the word count while you're drafting. That's something to focus on when you're revising. Let's talk about appendices briefly, then we'll go on that heading levels and be done. Appendices are materials that are at the end, and you can think about them in terms of information that a reader needs, but they don't really need at the moment. Like, for example, an interview script that you did an interview with your participants. It's important for me to see that as a reader at some point, but I don't need to read your entire script while I'm looking at your methods. In the methods, you just say participants were interviewed, and in the results, you talk about the interview, but I don't need to see the entire script. That can be an appendix at the end. They may require your appendices if you're cutting and pasting images, tables from somewhere. They may require a copyright attribution, which again, I know we've talked about this before, but it is important that copyright attributions do not look like a reference. They are formatted differently. We have this template in the Writing Center to help you. You just follow this. Don't question it, just follow it. And you're certainly welcome to pop into any open office hour, and we can help you with this, because it's one of those things that you don't deal with often, so it's kind of awkward and confusing. But this would be for, again, if you took an image from somewhere and you used it, or you took like a table or a figure from somewhere and used it. It's not yours. So how do we format the appendices? Each appendix, just like a table and like a figure, should have a call out at least once. You don't have to continuously call them out, but at least once, and really the first mention of it in the body of the paper, like see Appendix A, or the data from, the interviews is in Appendix C, whatever. Each appendix has its own page following references, tables, figures. So if you have any tables and figures that are waiting for the end of your manuscript, they're not embedded in the manuscript. The order is references, tables, figures, appendices. Appendices are last. There is no separate page that says appendices. I see a lot of writers do that. You just right away go into Appendix A. Each appendix has a label and a title, and they're bold and centered. If you only have one appendix, it's just appendix. That's all you call as appendix. If you have two or more, the first one mentioned in the paper is Appendix A. The second one mentioned in the paper is Appendix B. They're not in the order you want them to be. And this is a mistake I see a lot of writers make. They're like, no, I want my interview questions to come before, whatever. But if you mention that second thing first, then that's Appendix A. Whatever's mentioned first in the paper is A. Whatever's mentioned second is B, and so on. And you use bold title case. And then centered beneath the label is the title. It describes its contents. So like this, Appendix A, permissions letter from sponsoring institution. And then an appendix could be a table, figure, or text. If it's text, it's just like the text in your manuscript. Same font, double spaced, with paragraphs. It's going to look just like that. This we don't really need to worry about. This is so unusual, and this is really an editorial choice. But there's a difference between a table and figure that comes after the references and before an appendix, and a table and a figure that's actually embedded in an appendix. And it's that if it's in an appendix, they're called like table A1 or figure B2. Don't lose sleep over this, because it's super unusual. It would be a choice made by your mentor or an editor if you're publishing. If the editor makes it in publication, they're the ones who label it, so you don't even have to worry about it. If your mentor, says to do this, but they're not sure how to do it and you need help, check in with the Writing Center and we'll help you with that. But this is just a sample one. This is a interview questions. You can see Appendix A, bold and centered, needs assessment, semi-structured interview questions, bold and centered, and then it's just the questions. And then this is an example with tables, which again, this is unusual. And then finally, heading levels. Heading levels in APA, there are 5 of them. You don't have to use all 5. That's another mistake I see writers make, where they're like, I have to have a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4. No, you don't. You might only be using level 1 and 2, and that's fine. It really depends on how many subheadings you have. But this is their formatting. And they're like umbrellas. They're subheadings beneath them. So, for example, we have condition management. A subheading of that is therapy, which is one type of management, and pharmacology, which is another type of management. Then, this is obviously a case study. We're talking about the client. So, subheading beneath the client is their background, their signs and symptoms, their diagnoses. Those are all level 2s beneath the client. Impact on occupations and roles. And then there's a subheading there. See how we shift to italics? Work, hobbies, and leisures. These are the occupations and roles: work, hobby, leisures, health management, sleep, etc. So they're subheadings. You just follow the format. One way that I check for my headings is I'll go ahead and I'll draft them. I'll have like a document like this with all these headings. And then I'll do just exactly this. I'll pull out those headings and I'll put them in a separate paper. Like I'll put them in a separate document, just the headings, just like this. So it almost looks like an outline. And then I step back and I look at it and I look to make sure that the headings make sense in terms of their order, that the subheadings make sense as subheadings. Because I might have thought something was a subheading, and then as I look at it, I think, no, that's actually its own heading. It's not a subheading. that I have at least 2 of each kind of level. There can be an odd number. I can have 3, I can have 5, but I have to at least have 2. So I check for that. And I also check for redundancy, or do I have 2 headings, like 2 themes in a lit review that are so similar they really could be combined. They don't make sense separately. So that's a nice way to check them as you're revising. Heading levels do not have numbers or letters. They do not have colons. I see colons a lot. No colons. Again, avoid having only that one subsection. I just mentioned that. Your headings, again, your entire manuscript is double spaced. There's no extra spaces around the headings. They are always in title case, meaning major words are capitalized. Do not introduce any abbreviations in a heading. And your headings should also be in parallel forms. That's another thing you can check for when you pull them out and make that outline. Like, do you suddenly have a word that doesn't make sense, like origin, initial, rising? Oh, suddenly I have a verb in here. So I need to change that. So that's another thing that you can check for.